Okay, welcome back. Welcome to our third panel. The topic of this panel is Defiance. I'm Sylvia Weisbord. I'm on the faculty of the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University, and it's my pleasure to moderate this panel. Thank you to Barbie and everybody else who worked so hard in putting this symposium together. I will briefly introduce each speaker. Each speaker will have, again, 10 to 12 minutes to talk, and then we'll open up. We're going to start with Elizabeth Jelin. Jelin is an Argentine sociologist who has done work in research in the areas of human and citizenship rights, social inequality, gender and the family, social movements, and memories of political repression. She's a senior researcher at the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research and the Institute of Economic and Social Development in Buenos Aires. I could go on and on, but Elizabeth has been a mentor of mine for a long time and a friend supporter. And in 1986, she asked me, would you be interested in studying a PhD in the United States? And here I am. Chevy.
Well, a big pleasure being here, and thanks for the invitation. I'm not a media expert, and I will not talk about media, I'll talk about communication. And I start with the premise that communication is a right, not a commodity. And as such, people have the right to speak, but also the right to listen, and to listen to a variety and a plurality of voices. So this is kind of the premise of the way I approach this subject. And I will talk about Argentina and give a couple of examples. And under dictatorial regimes, fear and censorship involve the need of popular movements to develop alternative forms of communication and expression. Clandestine publications, double language and messages, irony and humor, performative practices have been tactics to express resistance and convey information and opinions. The movement we know, Women in Black, is a way in which women in various countries have talked without words. In the case of Chile, going to the cemetery where in groups was again a practice of resistance. The white diaper scarf of the Madres de Plaza de Mayo in Argentina was a means of communication and creating also a sense of belonging. There is also a role of international solidarity and media campaigns. Yet, even under formal democracies, conventional media are highly concentrated in the hands of big business, usually also with some benefits from discretionary governmental communications and advertising resources. The case of Argentina is when media are extremely concentrated. The concentration is a vicious circle in which groups with a dominant position impose the rules of the game to the rest of the actors. They take advantage of political lobby from their privileged position and capture more and more portions of the revenue from private advertising and official advertising. During the last couple of years, and we have a change of president next Tuesday, so during the last 4 years, during the last 2 years more, 3,500 people working in the media have been dismissed, in part by the process of concentration, in part by the process of not having opposition within the establishment media. So, given this media concentration, even under formally democratic regimes, popular movements have to continue having to find ways alternative, unconventional, and highly innovative forms of communications. In the case of Argentina, I want to give 3 small examples of this type of alternative ways of communicating. One is this. This is a green scarf which we carry in our, either around the wrist or we carry somewhere. Mostly women, also some men. And this is the national campaign for the right to legal, safe, and free abortion. I don't know how to go about. Is this a computer? No. Which one is the? Ah, it's here. It's here because so. This is the campaign, and this is the scarf, which says sexual education to decide, contraceptives to not abort, legal abortion not to die. This is the slogan of the campaign, which started in about around 2003 by a small group of organizations. By now, there are about more than 500 local NGOs, organizations of women all over the country that participate in this campaign. Let's show you a couple of pictures of what this gentleman is selling, some of those scarves. And in rallies, some of them with hundreds of thousands of people, what we have is a pañuelazo, which means a big shouting and showing the green scarves as the societal move to have free abortion. Why green? The green color was at that time when they started vacant because the violet was the color of feminism, white was the color of the madres, red was of the left, and so green was vacant, so the green was chosen. And others say that it's a color of hope, others say other things, but actually what happened was that it was vacant. This is a persistent communicative practice, both in everyday life, and it looks for a continuity with the Madres de Plaza de Mayo. As you can see here, the Madres with their white scarves. And clearly, it's a society expressing itself, yet civil society has also another side. Oh, this is the blue scarf. This is the blue scarf of those who oppose abortion and talk about 2 lives, the lives of the mother and the lives of the baby to be born. That's the way. And they use the blue. It's much smaller than the green campaign, but so this is one way of expression by performance. The second, which I want to say, is Ni Una Menos. Ni Una Menos began in 2015. It's a movement against feminicide. We don't want one woman less. That is, we don't want any woman to be killed. And this is interesting because it was started by one journalist, a feminist journalist who sent a message after a feminicide of a very young woman. She sent a message to her colleagues saying, shall we keep quiet? Shall we expect the next killing? And so they mobilized and began this type of rallies. This is the first rally in June 3rd, 2015. And since then, this movement expanded to many countries and to many marches. And it then led to the first, and following that, the next women's strikes on March 8th. So, and this is a group of senators, women senators, dressed in black, carrying the banner Ni Una Menos. So there is the idea is to expand with getting into into Congress. But laws will not help with feminicides. We know that. This is the size of the rally, of one of the rallies. And that's the type of thing that's going on. And many people carry like this. This little girl says, for my mother and for all the others that are not here anymore. So there are all kinds of personal signs and massive signs. The third one is a journal, is a magazine. The third one, which I want to show you, is this magazine. I have here a few copies if you want to go around. This is a magazine called La Garganta Poderosa, the powerful throat. And it's, as you see, the covers are always shouting. And this is a magazine, a monthly magazine, which started in a squatter settlement, and it tries to give a sense of squatter settlement culture against the idea that squatters and poor people are in the issues of drugs and of delinquency. So it's presenting the alternative, and it attempts to counter stigmatization of mainstream media. No, oh, no, this, I'm sorry, I had a few more of the others. In Lima, that's their sign, La Poderosa, the powerful, Resistencia Villera. Villas are the squatter settlements, the resistance of squatter settlements. And the interesting thing is that it's a collective. It attempts to counter stigmatization of mainstream media, and they use a lot. This I translated. Their writing is typical of spoken language, which contrasts the formality used by traditional journalism. As a way to revalue the villero culture and detach it from the prejudices with which it's normally associated, the journalists from this squatter settlement have chosen to write with a vocabulary that claims to be faithful to the language that they use. In this way, the writing identifies and highlights them while being transgressive toward traditional journalism. So one article begins like that, their presentation begins like that, and then the next one says something like this, that we set out to make it, to show you that and the main thing here is that for us intellectuals, we are very bad repeating what others said, but we are very good in putting out the smoke they sell us. So do not expect quotes from the authors who quoted thinkers, who quoted gods, who now are quoted by professors. So that's the way of putting what they are after. By now, again, this is a movement that grew. La Poderosa is a journal and a website and a radio and books and so on that goes into several other countries in South America. Because they claim, because as long as they continue to impose their priorities in the name of education, being rude will remain our best option. So this is Maradona, so their covers may be Maradona, Messi, somebody who feminicide. This is one of the leaders of the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo. This is the ex-president of Uruguay, Pepe Mujica. This is what, and this, and I will take a few minutes, just a couple of minutes. This last issue, and this gentleman is a professional journalist, he just died, a professional journalist who decided to commit himself to this group and was able, on the basis of his professional expertise and prestige, to have the journalists from this squatter settlement into a primetime TV program. as columnists. And it is, of course, female journalists who have this column. And when Marcelo Sotoviasa died, he knew he was going to die from cancer. He asked people not to send flowers, but to send goods that will be distributed in these poor neighborhoods. And during a month, there were tons, literally. There was no way in which they could carry so much stuff. The street of the TV station was directly covered completely by the goods and by the popular and societal response to his call. So what I want is perhaps to say that there is also another side to complicity and to authoritarianism vis-à-vis the mainstream media. Thank you.
Thank you, Chevy. Our next speaker is Farida Nabourema. She's a political activist, blogger, and writer known as the unequivocal voice for Togo's pro-democracy movement. She serves as the executive director of the Togolese Civil League, an NGO that promotes democracy and rule of law in Togo. She also founded the Fare Must Go movement, which organized Togolese youth to stand against the dictatorial regime of the Nasingbe, the oldest military regime in Africa. Her work for democracy and human rights has appeared on CNN and Time.
Thank you for having me. I will be talking about the citizen journalism under authoritarian government and how citizens actually organize to not only report but disseminate information and create a parallel type of information on the state media. My country, Togo, has been ruled by a military regime for the past 52 years. We are actually the oldest military regime in Africa. People rarely ever hear of us because it is one very small country. This is how big Togo is on the map of Africa. And in addition to that, we are a French-speaking country because we're a former French colony. As a result, in mainstream media internationally, it is almost impossible to find anything on Togo. The very few times that we were mentioned in mainstream media had to do with sports, when we were lucky enough to play at the World Cup the one time in our existence, and in some other cases when there are issues affecting West Africa in general. When you live in a country like Togo, of course, like in any other military regime, there is no such thing as a free press. Of course, the press is entirely controlled by the military government, and all you are fed with in the media is how great the president is, especially for a country like Togo. We had a dictator who was so fond of himself that people had to line up every day to clap for him till he died. Every morning, every afternoon, every evening. It was actually 4 times a day. And people had to dance for him and say how wonderful and blessed we are to have such a great president for 30-something years. But then journalists, there have been some efforts by journalists to try to break with the propaganda media. But of course, the government shut down this type of media very much. So I, as a blogger, I became a blogger back in 2009, and I was still in college then. I, as a blogger, had a certain level of collaboration with the local media, because there are laws that banned local medias from reporting on certain issues or from calling on politicians when they are engaged or involved in any corruption scandal, because those journalists can be tried for sedition libel, because we have Sedition Libel Act in Togo, and spend time in jail. What they did was to share those information. We had a network where the investigative journalists were the one most of the time doing the the investigations, and us, the citizen journalists, the bloggers, the political bloggers, were the one sharing the information. So now we will share the information, and the journalists will go back reporting on what we shared and say, well, Farida was writing on her blog that this minister is a thief. Of course, the journalist himself cannot say that the minister stole $400 million from the government, even though he has information. And we, the bloggers, we were not bound by the state journalistic, like laws against journalists. So there was a huge collaboration among us. Beyond that, there were also a lot of work that we ourselves as bloggers, we did on the ground. I went to communities. When I went back to Togo, I went to communities, tried to report on certain issues such as corruption, human rights abuses. I gave my platform to other Togolese activists who were able to share the realities that they were living in their communities and all around the country. And of course, when we organize in such a way, journalism and blogging become a tool of resistance, because there were things that we couldn't say in the past that we are now able to, thanks to social media as well. And beyond that, it is very difficult for the government to control that kind of reporting, unlike local media where they can just go and shut down. They shut down TV stations, medias, radio stations, but it is very hard for them to shut down a blog unless they put a hand on the blogger itself and eliminate him or simply shut down the internet in general or block access to a certain website. But these are also happening because, of course, governments always try to find a way to close the civic space and also try to find a way to restrict access to that kind of information that is detrimental to them. I see the role of citizen journalists as being the one who play the middle way between local media on one side and also international mainstream media. In the case of Togo, for example, in my own example, it wasn't until I started tweeting immensively on the political struggle in Togo, how we were organizing on a day-to-day basis, that we started getting the attention of foreign media, that I was being contacted by international mainstream media like CNN, the New York Times, Washington Post, and also European medias like the Deutsche Welle, France 24, because they, or in other situations, wouldn't have direct access to these informations on the ground. So they come to us to try to know what is happening, and they also get to us to be able to communicate directly with some opposition leaders and activists on the ground, and even to communicate with our comrades who are in prison, because we have a way of communicating with them even though they are still behind bars. Now, I want to touch a little bit on the effects of citizen journalism and how these actually contribute to supporting or strengthening democracy, or should I say, in our case, we are not a democracy yet, so we can't be strengthened, weakening authoritarianism. The one thing about citizen journalism is that it demystifies the political elite or the military regime in the case of Togo. If for many decades, the only information people get is about how great the regime is and how powerful and invincible they are, but the people themselves who are experiencing the authoritarianism know that these are lies. At some point, they see the leaders in power as being invincible, and there is no way anybody can go around saying something else about them. Now, citizen journalism do prove the point that these leaders actually are human beings, and they are committing crime that we can prove, and we provide those proofs to the people so they can understand that they are not just gods or some sort of untouchable beings that we don't have anything to trouble. The other thing is that it also deconstructs the rhetoric about these regimes internationally. Some few years ago, when you Google anything about Togo's politics or the current president of Togo, who inherited the presidency from his late father that ruled Togo for 38 years, it is always said Fonya Singbe was elected in 2005 in the aftermath of his father's death, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, he was never elected. His father died. He did a military coup. He took over in a bloody way, and over 1,000 Togolese citizens were killed for a country that back then had only 5 million people. Now, by citizen journalists went out there changing that rhetoric, that today when you do a little bit of research on Togo, even on Google, then you know that he is no longer the elected president people think he used to be. He's actually a tyrant and a dictator who seized power through a bloody coup after his father died. That rhetoric alone, it matters a lot. The reason why it matters is because our governments, especially governments like Togo's, try to always portray the idea that they are, amazingly, they try to portray the idea that they are a democracy. And in some cases, in regards to the United States, it helps them access certain level of funding or support from the US government. Back in 2018, my team and I were working on preventing the Millennium Challenge Corporation MCC from giving them a grant, which they needed to respect certain clauses such as human rights and rule of law to qualify for that. And thanks to the lobbying work that we did to some extent, that grant was put on hold because we managed to bring out the human rights atrocities that were going on in Togo. And the government wasn't very happy about that. So they started investing massively in hiring PR firms in the United States who can help them repair their image outside of Togo so they can qualify again for those kind of grants and international support. Today, one of the things that is hindering citizen journalism in Togo is surveillance. The government did invest a lot in surveillance. In our case, they spent massive money in purchasing a software called Pegasus, which is created by a firm, an Israeli firm called NSO. And with that Pegasus, they have been able to infiltrate the platforms, the electronic devices of a lot of bloggers and writers and journalists, and they have been able to kind of like scaring and threatening and even arresting and torturing a lot of those people. As a result, people are becoming a little bit more careful about what they say or not say, or who they share certain information to electronically or not. And we are still also organizing to find ways we can continue using social media to kind of like create a bridge between the Togolese people who live in Togo and the diaspora who is also in the struggle against dictatorship in Togo. Finally, before I go, I wanted to add one thing, is that when you live in a country like Togo where your whole life, all you see is one person as president for like 50-something years. And then you look at other countries like the United States where you have Donald Trump and people are very convinced that they live under dictatorship. On one side, you do wish you live in the American dictatorship. But then on the other side, you also do want the Americans to be very careful and to continue resisting because they at least have it easier to resist than we do. And I always say that in a case like Togo, we don't even have rights yet. We are fighting for the right to have rights. And when you have the freedom of speech and you have the ability to use your platforms to promote democracy and strengthen democracy, it will be unfortunate to not take advantage of those to strengthen your democracy and make your country a better place. Thank you.
Thank you, Farida, for the wonderful presentation. Our last speaker is Maria Ressa. Where to start? Long bio. She has a long and distinguished career as a journalist in Asia for more than 30 years. Maria was CNN bureau chief in Manila and Jakarta, and became CNN's lead investigative reporter focusing on tourism. In 2012, Maria co-founded Rappler, where she's the CEO and executive editor. The platform is one of the most influential and innovative news organizations in the Philippines. Maria has been honored around the world for her courageous work in fighting disinformation, fake news, and attempts to silence the free press. Last year, Maria was named Times Person of the Year, and most recently, she was named one of Time's 100 most influential people of 2019. She's the author of numerous books. It's my pleasure to welcome her to the stage.
Thank you. I'm the last speaker, so I will. I think the one thing that we've been missing, and Maryam talked about it quickly, was social media, right? So for me, Rappler, when we began it, our whole idea was to take investigative journalism, combine it with technology and community. We build communities of action, right? So let me just take you through, how do we, by all accounts, we should already have been closed down. The government tried to close us down last year. But we're still here, and I still go back. So I'm just going to do 3 points here. The first is, what is the problem? To be honest, when you debate what authoritarianism means, I think you have to think that an atom bomb exploded, and these definitions that we're grappling with, throw it all out, because the world as we used to know it is destroyed. It's destroyed. We are going to have to create something new. So my problem definition is very simple. It's a battle for facts, right? Because with social media, that is the accelerant now that has led to populist leaders getting elected, and it began 2015, 2016 it accelerated. Without facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. If you have none of these, you can't have democracy, right? And that's what we're seeing. So the problem for me is this is the battle for truth. Truth is in the eye of the beholder, but facts are not, right? Facts, truth, trust. Case study is the Philippines. I'll throw it to you because we spend the most time on the internet, more than 10 hours a day. We also spend the most time globally on social media. This is according to Hootsuite. We are social. It's 4 years running that's happened. And I look at Cambridge Analytica, Chris Wiley. I cornered him in September this year. His lawyer has been trying to keep him away from me. But we were on the same panel in Australia, so as soon as we walked off the stage, I dragged him into the green room and shut the door. This is what he told me. He said that the Philippines is the petri dish, and that when it was still SCL, Cambridge Analytica was operating in the Philippines, and that they tested tactics of mass manipulation there and in other countries in the global south, and if it worked, the word he used was they ported it over to the United States and the West. Why the Philippines? We speak English, number one. We are I'm going to say former colony, but the politically correct word, it was a protectorate of the United States, right? Any digital product that is tested for a global market is tested first in the Philippines. So Yahoo used to test in the Philippines. Finally, I'll end with potential solutions, because there is a solution. Because I'm going to depress you first with data, and then I'm going to try to tell you there's a way ahead. There were 4 covers last year. The Capital Gazette, the journalists who were murdered there, the journalists in Myanmar who were arrested, and Amal Clooney was their lawyer who helped get them out. And of course, this brutal dismembering of Jamal Khashoggi. Out of the 4 of us, one of the things I realized that journalists have to start thinking about is, out of the 4 covers, I was the only one who was both alive and free at that point in time, right? That's insane. That's how much the world has changed for journalists. Here's the fundamental thing, and I'm going to use Tim Snyder. He actually, if you guys have, I'm sure you've read On Tyranny already, but only 150 pages, so that's where our definitions of authoritarianism, fascism, dictatorship, it's all there. So before the one on the left, I just told Al Jazeera, if you can make people believe lies are the facts, then you can control them. A lie told 1 million times on social media is fact. I'm no longer a journalist in the Philippines. I'm a tax evader, right? You pound it enough, it is true. And Tim Snyder kind of said it in a 4-step way, which leads back to civic engagement. If you want to rip the heart out of a democracy, you go after facts. That's what modern authoritarians do. Step 1, you lie all the time. Step 2, you say it's your opponents and the journalists who lie. Step 3, everyone looks around and says, what's truth? There is no truth. And then resistance is impossible and the game is over. You can't have civic action if you have no facts, right? And it's familiar to you guys here. This is what happened in the Philippines, patriotic trolling. This was in 2015, we started working on this report with 12 other researchers from around the world. It was finally released in 18, patriotic trolling, state-sponsored online hate and harassment campaigns to silence and intimidate. You flood the market with false news, with disinformation, with lies. Women are a favorite, easy target. In the Philippines, women are targeted at least 10 times more than men. And that's only in the first year. We've been living through this stuff for 3 years. 3 steps in the Philippines. First, attack the credibility of the person, allege corruption. Doesn't matter if it's true, you repeat it 1,000,000 times. I'm a criminal, a tax evader. 2, you use sexual violence, especially with women. You inflame the biases, you fuel misogyny, you degrade that, target as a sexual object. You can't really have credibility when you've been torn apart this way on social media. I've been called every single animal you can think of. The attacks came as, in October 2016, 90 hate messages per hour for at least a month, right? It changes the way you look at the world. And then finally, the third step was they tried to trend these hashtags, hashtag arrest Lila de Lima. This is what happened to her. She is a senator, a first-time senator who used to be our Commission on Human Rights, Justice Secretary. She's been in prison for more than 2 years now without really any trial. So they trended hashtag arrest Lila de Lima. In May 2017, they tried to trend hashtag arrest Maria Ressa. It didn't work, which is why I think I didn't get arrested till 2019. So social media is critical, right? Since that time cover last year, I posted bail 8 times. I am out on bail. I face criminal charges. I had a hearing. I mean, I have 11 cases that are ongoing right now, and I could go to jail for 63 years. Hashtag arrest Maria Ressa, May 2017. This is how they did it, and you can kind of see. So this is one of the content creators working with the government. He took the story we did on the Trump-Duterte letter. We published it, the Washington Post, Intercept published it in the United States. We co-published with them, right? Rappler just made the Philippines a legitimate target of North Korean nuclear missiles. Aren't you guys gonna laugh at that? I laughed when I saw it. Hashtag arrest Maria Ressa. Well, some people took it seriously. It jumped to the campaign pages, like in Ecuador, like in other countries around the world. The social media campaign machinery becomes the machinery for repression, right? Becomes the disinformation network. So it jumped here. Ipatawag na yan sa Senado. Call her to the Senate. Hashtag arrest Maria Ressa. I wasn't called to the Senate till many, many months later. But you can see how they astroturf it. It's like fertilizer in the public sphere. And then they make government repression acceptable before they do it. Then from there it jumps to a real person, an overseas Filipino worker. I can smell an arrest and possible closure of Rappler.com. It did happen like 2 years later. We're not yet closed, although they tried to close us. I was arrested February this year for the first time and then detained overnight because they just wanted to let me feel their power, and then arrested again like 4 weeks later. Then it jumps to a real person, and this is where the attacks become sexualized. Maybe Maria Ressa's dream is to become the ultimate porn star in a gangbang scene. It's not, but you know, it's there, right? I mean, what do you do? And then when it comes out of the most powerful persons, he hasn't been that bad with me personally, but he's called another journalist, a woman who challenged him, a prostitute, right? They've labeled the word, they've used the word prostitute, which has surprisingly popped up in many countries around the world. From there it jumps, this is a kid. He's a senior in college when he posted this on Rappler. Me to the RP government, make sure Maria Ressa gets publicly raped to death when martial law expands to Luzon. It would bring joy in my heart. What does this do to our values? Again, it goes back. These are social media platforms, American social media platforms, right? This is happening globally. This is a huge problem. We must stop facts from getting degraded, right? Look at the kind of real attacks against traditional media. This is January 2015 all the way here, and then you go down, that's April 20, that's post. This is, here you go. This is when Duterte was elected. This is August 2017. So you can actually see, just like in the United States and many parts of the world, they take a fracture line of society and pound it until it bursts open, right? That's what they've done with Black Lives Matter. This is all working in the same way. So what did we do? I have a social media team. We live on social media. Rappler 63% women. The 4 founders are women. So we created a crude UX. We began a database. We call it the Shark Tank. These URLs are the websites that are seeded with fake news, in quotes. The ones in the middle are the Facebook pages and profiles that share those URLs. And then you can see the stats, right? I look at the average reposting, and you can see that if it's reposted more than 10 times, it'll turn red. After we came out with our first propaganda series in 2016, this is what it looked like. And this was like, it was around my birthday, October 2016. Look at how red it became. And I want to show you one account, Sally Matai. This was attacking all of the traditional media groups. And you can see that just based on this, you can see it's a cut and paste account. The same thing is happening to mainstream media all around the world. It is a systematic and very concerted attack on credibility of news. So it isn't just the fault of journalists, it is also manipulation, right? So you can see what happened here. The Marcos and Duterte campaign pages came together. That is where the information cascade goes. Let me show you one attack and show you the information ecosystem. This is an attack against our opposition leader. She's the vice president, Leni Robredo. This is January of 2017. Hashtag Leni leaks. When it's like this, it doesn't mean anything to you, but let me put it in a network map. It looks like this. And you can see exactly who the content creators are and which Facebook pages are amplifying it. And what's most fascinating for me here is it is so systematic that they've broken down the content creators by demographics. This is the same network that attacked me, that attacked Laila de Lima, that attacked journalists. And you can see here, this one for the motherland is a pseudo-intellectual account. I can't say intellectual, it's a pseudo-intellectual. That's the account that targeted Leni Robredo because they were trying to take the thinkers away from them. Middle class is targeted by Thinking Pinoy. And then the Mocha Uson blog is a singer-dancer who actively campaigned for the president. She now works for the government. This is the foundation of our information ecosystem, right? That's the foundation. From there, it jumps to traditional media, because that pseudo-intellectual account is a columnist here. Also, the publisher of this, of Manila Times, is actually in charge of Duterte's public relations, international public relations. So from there, it jumps to state media. And in state media, our state media is very proud to say they now work with both China and Russia. And from state media, you close the loop by just appointing the main mass-based account that dishes out the propaganda to government office. She was at this post for more than a year and then ran for office, for Congress. She failed at Congress, but she's now been appointed to another government position. Historical revisionism, they don't do it by post, they do it in the comments. It is death by 1,000 cuts, right? And look at how innocuous looking it is. It just plants the seed of a doubt that the history that you think you know isn't what you know. The next 2 slides, I will show you, and these are the last things, right? We use natural language processing on a LexisNexis database to be able to pull up topics and themes. And this is what you see. This is when I was coming home for an arrest warrant, December of 2018. Okay, so from that, you can kind of see the Philippines has 34% of the stories. The United States was 27%. But what the next slide will show you is the evidence of, what's our second panel's? Complicity. Here it is. This is complicity. The stories that were written from the Philippines, while there were more stories, essentially followed the Department of Justice press release. They didn't even ask me for a statement, and it was the American news organizations that labeled it a crackdown on freedom of the press, that it was a Duterte rights crackdown. Really interesting. We've finally gotten news groups together in the Philippines, but part of the reason other news groups that are large cannot speak as plainly as I do is because their businesses are under attack. My entire board from 2015 faced criminal charges, right? Because they were my friends. Anyway, I have more to tell you. Last two slides are really just the ecosystem, and I will wager that your information ecosystem is very similar to this. What's happened, so each of the circles, based on eigenvector centrality, the larger the circle, the greater its power to do an information cascade, right? These are each Facebook pages. And you can see how asymmetrical this is. The pro-Duterte, pro-Marcos communities have taken over the center of our information ecosystem. These are disinformation networks, propaganda pages. And then you have an anti-Duterte community. You can see the difference in size now, right? Where are the news groups? They're off. I don't have a... They're off to the sides because the news organizations refuse to share each other, right? They refuse to work each other, so they've been pushed out to the sides. Here's what happens. The only time when there was some kind of parody was when I got arrested. So the joke from Rappler is that they said I should have stayed arrested longer, but here's what happened. Barbie, you know, it's black gallows humor because that's the way I deal with anger management. So what you see here is that when I got arrested, the normal people came in and they started sharing traditional media, mainstream media. Those are the top ones, right? And it basically almost split evenly. The pro-Duterte, pro-Marcos clusters we're trying to create alternative news sites. They haven't been as successful as Alex Jones, but that is the end goal. Literally, I am seeing Philippine society torn apart this way. We've never had the kinds of left and right that you've had in the United States. We've never really had that. We didn't have a Fox and a CNN. We were all in the middle. And in 6 months, I watched it go this way. And then I also watched, because of the algorithms of social media, you talk to yourselves and you radicalize yourselves even further. So the public sphere is ripped apart, literally. I'm going to bring it to geopolitical power. So we found, this is January 2018, I will tweet this link to you, but we found links bottom up from the Philippines to the IRA, to the Internet Research Agency, and it's long and involved. But the data from the Senate Intelligence Committee hearings, that's this map up there. We found a link directly to the Philippines disinformation networks. Scary stuff. I'm just going to end it with what are we going to do, right? So this is our world today, and that's kind of the Tim Snyder thing. This is my world. Anyone who questions a brutal drug war, supports those who fight for truth, you attack them with the full force of the Philippine government. Make them cautionary tales for anyone defending truth. And what do? I sound a little bit like Pollyanna, but you start with your area of influence. You demand accountability from power. You fan the flames for facts, right? Because emotion is a question that you had. This is what social media manipulates. So before, all the old problems of populists are there, but when you amplify them on social media, where lies laced with anger and hate spread faster than facts, we do not stand a chance. I'm gonna leave you because I don't want you to be depressed. There's a minute a video of other journalists in the Philippines. I talk a lot because I think this is a critical moment. And frankly, you guys are the ones who must do something about it because, well, Facebook is yours, Twitter is yours, Google is yours. So that's really important. Plus, where America goes on this right now also has an impact on the rest of us. It's just the global south is far more affected. I'll leave you with this video.
Have you ever been harassed because of your work?
Yes.
Have you been threatened online?
Ay, oo.
Have you been called biased?
Yes.
Have you been called stupid?
Yes, plenty times. By idiots.
Have you been called disrespectful?
Yes.
Have you been accused of corruption?
Yes.
Have you been called ugly as a response to any story?
Yes.
Have you been called fake news?
Oh yeah, they always say I'm fake news. Anything that's critical is fake, right?
Have you been accused of being an imperialist spy?
Yes.
Have you been accused of being a communist operative?
Yes.
Have you been accused of working for the CIA?
Yes.
Have you been sexually harassed as a journalist?
Yes.
Has your family been threatened, harassed, or alluded to?
Yes, it has. Specifically my daughter. When she died, there were a lot of people who made fun of that.
Have you been threatened with rape?
Yes.
Yes.
No, not me, but my family.
Have you been threatened with violence?
Yes.
Have you been threatened with death?
Yes.
Have you been told how you're going to be killed?
Yes.
Has the violence been described to you?
Yeah, blow my head off or bury me alive.
What will stop you from reporting?
Nothing.
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 Death.
You have to kill me.
Thank you very much, Maria. That was an incredible presentation. Okay, open up the floor for your comments and your questions. Again, if you can make it brief and introduce yourself, I appreciate it. No, I think we're in the middle.
Hi, my name is Karen Curry. I'm a former journalist and adjunct at Drexel University. Maria, why are you able to be here? I mean, with all of what's going on, how are you able to be here and still keep speaking so openly?
I think most authoritarians want to have a veneer of rule of law, and so I hold them to it. It's a constitutional right to travel, but I've had to pay more than $60,000 to be free. And every time I leave, I have to apply to I have 8 different, I'm out on bail on 8 charges, so 8 different courts. I can't change my flight home. If something happens, they could technically, like I miss my plane, right? Technically, I could be arrested. So it's a crazy time, but I think that's the time when you have to like push. You have to stand up for it.
Thank you.
Thank you for the panel. It was very thought-provoking. I have a question or comment for Maria. First of all, I'm also a network mapping person, so I appreciate all your slides, and we have a similar counter data project back in Turkey that is kind of messing with the capital that
Oh, I'd love to see it.
AKP invested in. Yeah, I would love to share it with you. So I was like thinking about your comment about talking and radicalizing each other, and like the algorithmic component of the social media platforms, and I was like intrigued by your way of using like the trollers as trolls as like fertilizers in the public sphere, and I was wondering what it, have you observed or are these, to your experience, like manifestations of authoritarianism on the digital, right? And like you were calling it like this digital space as public sphere. I wonder why you specifically use the term, given it's actually like, I mean, I have some problems kind of contemplating like whether they are the same thing, like the digital geography and the public sphere, right? And also you also mentioned about certain maybe trustworthy outlets not sharing data, and have you thoughts about how to resolve that problem? Because I've been grappling with this question myself a lot, because like unless we share data, we will not be able to see like a more comprehensive truth about the world. And we also like, as activists or like intellectuals, we kind of like refrain from doing so. So thank you.
I sh- we
Should we take one more question and then we, Julia?
Julia Zonovan, New School for Social Research. Thank you for this amazing panel and the incredible work that you are doing and risks that you are taking. So I have a question about this argument about reclaiming facts, and that's certainly important, and I wouldn't question that. But is that really enough? You know, I'm just thinking that, let's say there is a Trump speech and we are running a fact checker there, you know, claiming each time when it's not true. Is that enough of a pushback? Should we also develop counter-narratives, counter-mythologies? Let's say the example that you gave on, you know, calling a distinguished journalist a tax evader is not only a counter-fact, it is also a counter-narrative. It's a whole story and mythology that they offer.
Right.
Should we offer something that is more of a counter-narrative?
Then we go to the panel, and then we take a few more questions.
So on I do think it is the public sphere. I think, you know, Facebook grapples a lot. By the way, I find it abominable that it is okay to lie, according to Facebook. We are a Facebook partner, so we're frenemies. We're one of their two Filipino fact-checking partners in the Philippines, and the reason why we do it, even though the studies say it makes no difference, is it does make a difference. You first need to find the lie, and then what we do is we don't stop with content, because content is only the first part. You look at the network that shares that, because it's like the terrorist networks, right? These are our modern terrorists. So yes, it is the public sphere because Facebook is our internet, right? 100% of Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook. So that is insane. When this started 3 years ago, it's 97%. I told Mark Zuckerberg, I said, 97% of Filipinos are on Facebook. And, he was frowning, and I tried to figure out why he was frowning. He said, Maria, where are the other 3%? He's really smart, all right? He's a really, really smart guy, but you have to look outside to see the impact of the stuff that you're doing in the States. So I think to answer your question, the old world versus the new world, right? We do have to share data, and I talked about like an atom bomb. Post-World War II, when Hiroshima, Nagasaki, when everything, Hitler, Nazi, and Stalin, when all that happened post-World War II, the world knew it needed to protect itself from the worst of humanity. So we had Bretton Woods, we had NATO, we had the UN Declaration of Human Rights. We need something like that now, because the internet is the first place where democracy gets torn apart. And Miriam talked about how, yes, activists and journalists can use it. Look, Rappler couldn't have grown without social media. We built it on this. But the reality is right now, the biggest enemy to democracy is technology, right? This needs to get both regulated and be far more transparent. If you wait for regulation, my best, there's no one, don't quote this one, don't tweet this one, but I keep saying if they don't do something right away, I could go to jail and I'll say it's your fault. But, it's like these, on the counter-narratives part, the problem is when lies spread faster and you're dealing with people who have no morality and who are using a scorched earth policy for power, how do the good guys fight, right? You can't. But what journalists should do is realize that we have a mission. The mission of journalism is far more important today than it ever has been. And we need to, on the fly, make decisions for definitions, right? We've never lived through anything like this. I've been a journalist for a long time, meaning I'm old, right? But I've never lived through anything like this. I've covered the push of democracy, starting in 1986 in the Philippines with people power. And then I've covered every single transition of countries in Southeast Asia, from authoritarian one-man rule to democracy. And now we're seeing the pendulum swing back. The fact-checking, Yes, important, but counter narratives, how do you do it? I think the first step is to come up with principles, whether it's like the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Leaving the American tech platforms alone hasn't worked. I'm still a partner, so I won't say anything more than that. But I think what needs to happen is you have to stop the poison. So think about it as like poison or a virus going into our democratic body politic, right? So this has to stop, but then what happens to the people who have already been infected? Then you have to rehabilitate that. That's what we have to do to our societies.
Anybody else in the panel wants to take one of these questions? Or?
I'm just interested in knowing or in I'm talking about popular movements. You are talking about technology. Are we talking different worlds? Or is there, what is your view about that?
I think for a period of time with the Arab Spring, we all thought that technology would enable greater civic engagement. But the way authoritarians, and it's actually, you saw it first with Russian disinformation in 2013, 2014, and then when instant articles kicked in on Facebook, now the bad guys are doing far more than the good guys. And I think, at least in my country, civic engagement, people don't know whom to believe, so they can't act. In the United States, if you look at MIT Media, Yochai Benkler wrote a book, right, where he said, he's actually saying that it was Fox News, but look at what was actually amplified on Fox News. It was the stuff that was embedded in Reddit. Pizzagate. It was an American Sputnik reporter who took social media lies and brought it into mainstream media, and Fox picked it up, right? So for me, it's the same world. That's why we need to first clean up the tech. I can't imagine a world without the tech, but right now, the way they've done it, they've gotten too greedy, and they've crippled us.
Let's get a question. Maryam, and
No,
then...
no, wait.
Sorry.
I'm sorry.
I wanted to kind of like add another perspective to what you just said, Maria. In the case of Togo and other African authoritarian regimes, when you say that technology is like the biggest enemy to democracy, it kind of like is the opposite in our reality, where technology has actually been the enabler and helpful to democracy. And authoritarian regimes on the continent are actually using the arguments you're making. And when you look at many countries on the African continent, Nigeria, Uganda, Togo, and many like Chad, the government's actually working on enacting new laws to block access to social media. Nigeria is currently working on what they are calling a fake news law. And they are the one, the hate speech actually, and they're the one that determines what is hate speech or not. And whatever, when you criticize the government, that is considered as hate speech. In other countries, you have laws on fake news, and in other countries, they are going as far as not only restricting social media, but they are shutting down the internet. Cameroon went on for months without access to internet. Togo went on for days without access to Facebook or WhatsApp. And in the reality of many Togolese people, when there is no WhatsApp, it means like it's worse than not having water or electricity. That's our life. So when we also have to be kind of like careful to be able to pinpoint how dangerously authoritarian regimes are using technology, but how they are also using technology as an excuse for authoritarianism. Because sometimes they use arguments like, well, people put a lot of fake news on the media, people instrumentalize the media. As a result, we the regime, because we love you so much, we're just going to shut it down. And for those of us who are combating these regimes, it becomes even more difficult to organize and mobilize. That's why I kind of like wanted to add that point as well. Yeah.
No, I think that's great, but my only worry is that perhaps they have such control in Togo that it's actually the government that does well, they don't have to, because they have such control, right? But you're correct. Our equivalent is like Singapore, with their fake news law, which is setting the stage. But I think that's part of the reason there has to be a global discussion. What do we do with data? How do we share it? How is it more transparent? What are the values that govern tech? What are the ethics? Standards and ethics is something we talk about for journalists. What about for tech people? How do news groups evolve to take tech in, and how does tech take journalism in?
Thank you. Mariam, and then we go in the back.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment very quickly and then ask a question, because the question about tech is something that is ongoing right now, and I've been doing a lot of work on tech and human rights, and conversations have been happening between Facebook, Twitter, and other companies with tech activists or digital rights activists. But there is a lot of listening, not much doing, unfortunately. And I think that in a lot of sense, like also with the wider range of human rights issues, it tends to boil down to accountability. Right. If there's no accountability, there's no incentive to change things. So I think that's part of the problem. And I was actually maybe not so much surprised, but I didn't know that they were testing out technology in the Philippines, because I know that Israel was doing the same with Palestinians, with facial recognition for Palestinians living under occupation. But my question is, and so I wanted to challenge you a bit, the information that you gave, the ideas that you have are amazing, but in a place like Bahrain, they wouldn't work, right? There's absolutely no space. The civil society space is no longer shrinking. It's decimated. It doesn't exist, right? So in situations like that, in places like Bahrain, like Saudi Arabia to a large extent, in Egypt, for example, places like that, what can be done? I mean, as activists living in exile, I feel that takes away a part of our legitimacy. And me, myself, I don't like to speak on behalf of people inside Bahrain, because I don't feel like I have the right to, since I'm not there, right? So what can be done when there is absolutely no space left for any kind of activism? You get either picked up, imprisoned, killed, thrown out of the country. So what do you do then? What happens then? And I'm asking this question not just for Bahrain, but because I think we're going to see more and more countries becoming that, unfortunately. Thank you.
Question on that side for everyone.
Okay, sure.
Two possible.
Are you living in Togo? Are you still in? I'm in exile now.
Thanks. Jack from Rutgers. What a great panel. What it made me think of is a different root word for complicity, which is also an accomplice. I know in racial justice, race-based justice movements, social justice now, the idea is we don't want allies, we want accomplices, right? People who act. So what I liked, Maria, your last slide with your tweet on it that said, start with your area of influence, take care of what's in front of us, right? I think that's really it. So I want to jump from there to ask Elizabeth a specific question about Nuna Menos and the journalists, and also the magazine that's been circulated. And if I can if you're giving any of those away, can I make a pitch for one of them? I would like one of them. but right, so we saw a different kind of accomplice orientation, a different alignment with that journalist who said, I'm going to use my resources and my connections to bring people into a different space. It's not about representing people, right? And it's not just about, thinking of some kind of abstract public that one is working in the name of, right? But that it's a series of actions. So I wonder if people want to talk about accomplices as a kind of flip side and solidarities of journalists. But Elizabeth, specifically, the journalist who started the Nuna Menos, who asked those questions, where was she based? What kind of media, where was she? And what was her audience? How did they pick this up?
Should we go to the panel? Let's go one more question, and then we go to the panel, please.
Jasper Jones, 88.1 FM, WPEB, Philadelphia Community Media. Thank you for your bravery in doing your work. And I noted that every one of you are actually talking about the government's conspiracy with big corporations to deny your people clean water, clean food, clean energy, and proper shelter. So the point that you have, that for the media suppression to end, the people in the United States have to be notified, And have any of you looked at the National Federation of Community Broadcasters and United States Human Rights Network as an ally partner to get your story out to the people in America, which will bypass mainstream media? And consider setting up in your countries a network of community radio stations to get your message out.
Okay, the panel? Chevy, you want to start?
I can start by saying something. There was many years ago a very influential article by Gayatri Spivak saying, talking about the voiceless, those who have no voice. Can the subaltern speak? That was the name of the article. Claiming that she was referring to India, that the people, the subaltern, had no voice. Many years later, in her own foundation and working in poor neighborhoods in India, she came up with the idea that she was wrong, that it's not a question that the subaltern cannot speak, it's a question that we don't want to listen. And it's a question that we, or the learned society, will not listen to those voices. So we need mediators. We need someone who will bring the voice of a subaltern. So, and this is a question of solidarity in what is the role of this, well, media is in the middle, the origin of it. And I think this is the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge is, do we need, that is how to empower people so that their voices shall be heard. And I think this is the challenge is not only that to bring out the solidarity of those towards those who suffer, but it's also try to enable the spaces where those who suffer can speak or can be heard. So this is as a general statement. Then the translation of that into specifics is quite difficult. So the issue of exile that Mariam brought up, exile and can you speak in the name of, there is enough diasporas that are also part of the society they had to leave. And so it's not that you speak in the name of, but you also speak as part of. And I think this is the issue of exile and being abroad is something that is not, we used to think that those who left, left. But we know that those who left did not leave. So I think that there are challenges in this, and this goes through social media, through printed media, or through alternative media. Some of the issues are the same for all.
Farida?
Yeah.
Maria?
Go ahead. To take on your question about whether we have tried to look into the National Federation of Broadcasters as an ally, in my case, I'll say no. However, we are constantly trying to reach out to media and also human rights organizations in the United States, but also in Europe and other parts of Africa, who can help us raise awareness on the dictatorship in our country, and who can also help us put pressure on the government to free the space, to respect freedom of association and speech and so on and so forth. So if you can connect us to more journalists or media that can help us bring more coverage on Togo, we'll always be happy to do that. We will be grateful, actually, to have such platform. So I wanted to kind of like directly respond to that one. Yeah.
Miriam, I'm going to leave your question for last. What can be done when there's no space left? But I think on the accomplice, I think this is one of those things where journalists have to figure out what is the line between journalism and activism, and actually embrace that journalism is activism, especially when it is when there are no facts. right? So for me, it became easier. I think I just got pushed into it, right? And I'm now defending myself. When I got arrested and it was these are trumped up charges, I'm like, I'm not going to shut up, at least as long as I can keep going. And I don't want to be in exile. I don't know. It's hard. Everyone faces these decisions, right? So I think journalism is activism. More than ever, you have to fight for truth. For me, it's facts, right? And then the second one of social media, you brought this up. I think the one thing we haven't talked about is what exactly is social media? These are behavioral modification systems, right? Shoshana Zuboff wrote a 750-page book. It comes down, the title is called Surveillance Capitalism. It just means you're being manipulated by big data. That's what it's saying. So think about it like this. Right now, they've gotten to the point that the micro-targeting, the business model of it, micro-targeting at this level, has created no longer a space, a public sphere. It has turned it into a behavioral modification system, and we are all Pavlov's dogs. And we are in there voluntarily. So that's why these things have to get rolled back in some way or evolved. And this is also why I started by saying, think that an atom bomb blew up, because it really did in our information ecosystem, which has a direct impact on our systems of governance. And then Miriam, how to answer what can be done when there's no space left. You should tell me that. I don't know. I just know that, and for Americans in the room, the time to fight is when you can still fight, right? If you're not fighting for the facts, you're going to lose it. I guess for me, our activism is, here's rule of law. Here is the Constitution. Power should be made accountable for this. If there's no accountability, there is impunity. Russian disinformation is proven in the Mueller report. What are you doing about it?
Okay. Rod?
Rod Benson at New York University, Media, Culture, and Communication Department. I wanted to come back to the issue of audiences and like who's hearing what you say. So to kind of go to that, who's listening, and how do you deal with that? Yochai Benkler was mentioned earlier, and some of his book on network propaganda shows these lovely red in the U.S. these red bubbles and these blue bubbles, and there's no green in the middle. There's almost no green in the middle anymore. And so what do we do about that? How do you go beyond preaching to the choir? If it's fact-checking, who cares about who reads the fact-checking PolitiFact? Who reads that? It's not the people you want to read that or that are reading that. It's people that already know probably that facts are important. So, what's the solution to that? Is it, part of the problem is algorithms and, the tech policy around that, because that kind of forces people into bubbles. But maybe part of it is communication strategy. And going back to that question that was raised at the end of the second session about cultural style, I'm thinking of, I think you almost said it, this new book by Bill Gates' colleague at CUNY, Reese Peck's book, Fox Populism, points to the cultural style of Fox. And it's not just their ideology, but it's their cultural style. And the mainstream media isn't even competing for that working class audience anymore, or that middle American audience. MSNBC is not really I don't want to just bring in U.S. examples, but MSNBC is not really the left alternative to Fox, because they've had some more populist, progressive populist shows, and they gave them up, and so there's there's very little non-right-wing media trying to reach a working class audience, an audience that isn't already on our side, that we need to bring over to our side in the battle against right-wing populism and authoritarianism. So.
Thank you. I think we'll go there. You can pass it, Mike. Thank you.
So I have a related question, I guess, on affect. Oh, I'm Florence. I'm a PhD student here. So I have a related question on, affects enough and some of Miriam's comments. And some of the things you said actually that sort of addresses truth-telling, disinformation, and those issues. So there are people that have been sort of talking about ideas of how we address this. One of those people is Jay Rosen at NYU, and about, we could sort of address this through the idea of transparency, right, instead of norms of objectivity. And some of the things he says are sort of like changing this voice or view from nowhere that a lot of like Western journalists have used, admitting when we don't know things, and sort of like making that known to build that trust. Sort of like making how we're reporting more transparent, right? So there's that idea. But then I was also wondering from, some of Miriam's comments, this idea of transparency, how useful that would be in, a place like Bahrain. And, sort of how in really repressive contexts, under surveillance, where people are trying to resist things strategically in places like Togo and I know in Zimbabwe, how we could sort of reconceptualize this and maybe not idealize so much this idea of transparency as a valid solution to some of the things, we're addressing.
One more question there or comment? Yeah. Barbie has a question.
I'm Megan. I'm also a graduate student here and on the steering committee. And my question is sort of based on all three of the panelists today, but especially this one and the last one. The question of complicity we talked about in terms of a lot of individual choices. And I, like Maria's video at the end of her presentation, those were a lot of journalists making clear personal decisions that they were going to be defiant. And I'm wondering if we can instead think about the question of defiance in structural, systematic terms. What are the systems that could be in place for people in media to be protected if they wanted to be transparent, if they wanted to be honest, if they wanted to be very defiant of repressive governments? And for people who work with media, informants, people who blow the whistle, how can we create systems that create an environment where we can resist authoritarianism?
I will ask you the panel if you can take 1 minute each, and then we go to Barbie's comment and question, and then we're going to.
Do my question because it's actually backing right off.
Oh, sure.
So if I just could, I love to back off of graduate students. Thank you, Flo. Thank you, Megan. So I guess I want to ask in a way that Megan framed as structural. I want to frame as occupational, because all of you are dealing with alternative modes of communication, right? Alternative ways of expressing resistance or defiance or whatever we call it. But when we say something like technology is the enemy of democracy, we are leaving absolutely no place for what happens occupationally. And I fear, right, as somebody whose livelihood has always been about thinking about what we call legacy, conventional, mainstream journalists, they aren't out of the picture yet, right? And they shouldn't be out of the picture. And I think that the more that we focus on an environment that does not take them into account, the ruder is going to be the awakening at the other end. Because particularly when we're talking about the United States, we have got to figure out how mainstream media, legacy media, connect with social media, connect with citizen journalists, connect with social movements. I mean, you say a journalist is an activist. You go up with that statement to most US journalists and they'll vomit on you, right? I mean, that is, they'll puke. They will not accept that.
I actually think that there is for the people who are practicing, right? So for example, there are reporters who have been following Trump, who the women reporters are not actually telling their bosses all of the things they're dealing with online, because they don't want to be seen as kind of like soft, right? So I'm saying, just like in, sorry, I jumped in. I'll shut up. Well, I think that you actually laid out what has to happen. mainstream media, traditional media has to come together with social media, has to come together with what Facebook calls coordinated inauthentic behavior. That is those are the disinformation networks. Now there has to be pushback from everyone who is like standing still. I think the news organizations now are far more activist, if you think about it. It took the New York Times a long time to call a lie, but it took me a long time to say lie. Even that word, I didn't say it until this year, and I was arrested this year, right? So,
Yeah, but Maria, sorry, I want to come back at you. That is correct. It did take the New York Times a long time to say a lie is a lie, but it got there. But the problem with that logic is that then we assume that the fact that they're saying a lie is somehow adequate.
No.
And it is far from adequate.
Yeah, of course. Which goes back to, I think you have to look at this time period as a time when everything has been destroyed. Just like there's a semblance of democracy in the Philippines, part of the reason I'm like jumping up and down is it is not a democracy anymore. It is captured. I better shut that live stream, but this is to our membership, so guys, I'm gonna take that down. Anyway, I think the same thing has happened in the United States, and people have to find new words to describe it, new formulations. How do we fight it? So what we're doing in the Philippines is all of the news groups themselves are finding it hard to speak up because of their businesses. So the journalists, the individual journalists are coming together. We're all kind of working together now, right? We're rolling out a new tech platform in January that actually optimizes not for time on site, but for civic engagement, for action in the real world. The other one of, I think the other big change is that emotional manipulation. We're still putting thinking slow tactics to try to deal with thinking fast problems. And as human beings, this behavioral modification system has manipulated us to the point that thinking slow can't even catch up. So we have to stop first we have to step out of the instinctive emotional rush in order for us to find the rational solutions. Does that make sense? I think they're shifting. I know it's frustrating. I'm frustrated, but I've not lived through anything like this before. And I have lots of conversations, and journalists themselves although European journalists are far more like hard-nosed about sticking to old definitions. Sorry. But, you also are coming out with GDPR faster than others, so.
Farida, Sherry, any last comments?
What I was thinking is that you say you're concerned with the job market and with the journalists, but journalists are also citizens and will act as citizens in the way in which others do. So there is one part in which journalists have a very special multiplying effect because others will read them, but also they will be or will not be activists according to their own beliefs, their own ideologies, and their own facts. So there is no way of imposing something, and there is no way in which you can kind of say put journalists in a limbo, in a different space than the rest of us.
What I want to say is that social media did become a tool of resistance for many throughout the world. But at the same time, very recently, it is becoming a tool of repression because the regimes are realizing that they too can use social media against activists and journalists and people who are trying to deconstruct their systems. Earlier this week, I was meeting with a journalist who was actually interviewing about surveillance, digital surveillance in my country, Togo. And when he revealed some of the findings that he did in regards to government surveillance in my country, my question to him was, why are we allowing the tech companies to get away with things like this? Because you do have sophisticated tech companies that are creating softwares and systems to allow the government to not only manipulate the opinions, but also surveil citizens and create a form of propaganda that is detrimental to those people. What I will say is it is important for us to now start working on how to push for regulations, the regulation that will not restrict the digital space, because in some countries that is the only space we have, and we will rather share it with the dictator than have none at all, because if they can come and troll us, but we still have a way to combat their trolling or put the information up there, we still want to keep that space. We don't want it closed. But how do we make sure that the space is safe for everyone, them included? Because sometimes they too are victims of our trolling to some extent. Not that it isn't fun trolling somebody who wants to kill you, but at least we want to make sure that the digital space is safer for everyone, but safer not in a way that the dictators are portraying it, because for them safer means they get to be seen positively and having people praising them, but safer in a way that it protects those who are human rights defenders, those who are promoting democracy, those who are sharing truth and facts. And I believe it is a conversation that we need to start having, not only in the academia, but also in institutions, regional institutions, international institutions, and now start pushing and advocating for legislations that are going to hold tech companies also accountable and involve them in the process of strengthening democracy and avoiding having their platforms and their resources used to coerce people. And one of the things that I told the journalist when he asked me, he said, if there is one thing that you will tell that company, and I wouldn't mention it now because the investigation is not already published, but I said, for me, I see them as the same organizations or companies that were using, that are providing services to the Nazi regime. There were some companies that were loaning their cars or their trains to transport people to the concentration camps. These tech companies are also operating in the same way. They are providing a platform for oppressors to use to oppress people, to shut down democracy, to abuse citizens, and to close civic space and restrict freedoms in many ways. So they must be held accountable, and there must be regulations to demand that accountability and proceed with it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think we just run out of time. So I would like to thank all the panelists for your wonderful presentations and comments. Thank you very much. And now we go to the closing.